So thank you very much to Samantha and Selena for coming to this morning to talk to me and Vlad in the third one now of our possibility studies conversations. My name is Wendy Ross. I'm a senior lecturer at London Metropolitan University, and I'm really interested in the role of environmental uncertainty in human cognition, problem solving and decision making. Vlad, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Right. Hello. Hi, everyone. So my name is Vlad Glaveanu. I'm head of psychology and counseling at Webster University, Geneva, and I'm directing the Webster Center for Creativity and Innovation. And as the title of the center suggests, I'm working on creativity and innovation in a socio-cultural distributed perspective.
Samantha.
Hi, I'm Samantha Copeland. I'm an assistant professor at the Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, and I'm in the Ethics and Philosophy of Technology section. So I work on ethics in contexts of uncertainty, and I focus on epistemology issues, so issues about knowledge production and the role of who we count as knowers, when, and where in our strategies for dealing with the unpredictable.
And Selena?
I'm Selene Arfini. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Humanities of the University of Pavia. I'm a researcher in philosophy of science and epistemology, but I'm especially interested in the analysis of ignorance and hypothetical reasoning. I've also become attracted to the concept of chance since I've met you all, actually. First, Samantha, a few years back in one of the most interesting conversations I had visiting Tilburg University, and then by serendipitous encounters also with Wendy, and lastly, Vlad, through actually the friendship with Wendy and Samantha.
Yeah, I think we should say that we all have overlapping research interests. So we're not just come together for this, but each of us are working with each other on different aspects that all sort of coincide and work in with the possible. And Selena's contributed an entry to the Vlad's encyclopedia, as have I, and as has Vlad, and as we will no doubt ask Samantha to do as soon as she has any bandwidth in her life.
Absolutely.
So Vlad, would you like to start off maybe by saying how you see the possible?
Right. Well, I'm always shy to do that because, again, I have quite a particular view, perhaps, and maybe quite a psychological view. So I'm very excited to talk to philosophers about this, definitely, because I start with an understanding of human action and agency in the world. I think that's kind of the starting point, right? And what fascinates me about the possible is that human action functions on multiple levels, if you want. There is an immediacy of action in the way we perceive and act on the world in the here and now. And then at the same time, we're very much informed by things that are not in our present situation. We imagine things that are going to come. We even anticipate what's going to happen next in the next moment, right? We bring back things from the past. I mean, normally we call that memory, but for the purpose of talking about things that are not in the present. We also make all sorts of counterfactuals and we create alternatives to reality. And I think when people study play as a form of action, that becomes immediately obvious. So in a way, the possible for me is exactly all of these spheres of experience that are surrounding and infusing what is in the present. And the core of the possible for me is this idea of difference. So I'm very much committed to difference. And Wendy and I, we had these dialogues that some of them are recorded on the channel as well. So what do I mean by difference? There's so many differences, right, that we are surrounded by. I mean, there's a difference between past, present, and future that we kind of create, perhaps psychologically. I mean, time is a continuum, but we still kind of separate things in this manner. There is a difference between the object and the way I name the object, so between the material and the symbolic. Although these are articulated, obviously. And there's a difference between self and other, ego, alter. That's probably the most fascinating difference. And I feel that the engine of possibility lies within these differences. And the fact that we can always explore the world through the eyes of another person, for instance, or we can, in a way, possibility comes out of our efforts to bridge differences, but also to kind of diversify and explode difference, if you want, in our experience of the world. So I don't know if I should say much more. I'm very curious what you're thinking about, and what would be your starting point, and what would be your favorite vocabulary of possibility. Because for me, as I said, it's action and differences and perspective. And I'm going to throw in dialogue, but we can talk about that as the day progresses.
Okay, if I may, I have a few questions, but I have an observation on what you just said about possible. The question relates to how do you approach difference in a philosophical way? Are you familiar with the works on Derrida on difference and difference?
Totally.
Or well, it's the first thing that pops to mind if you know a bit of continental philosophy. Is it's a great concept, but is also a very much complex one in the sense that it has not a neat definition.
Right.
Sorry.
No. I mean, I do not know as much about Derrida. I know his concept of difference. I think I'm coming more, if I'm to anchor myself philosophically, I think I'm coming more from a pragmatist kind of theory of action and Dewey, Mead, James. I think that's kind of my entry point. So perhaps it's less complex, I'm sure, than Derrida's perspective.
I was thinking. So one thing about Derrida is he tends to be very negative. So difference leads to deconstruction, right, in his philosophy. But what's interesting about taking the possibility angle is that you can look at that disjunct, and it doesn't have to be jarring, and it doesn't have to be a taking away. So can I jump in with a little bit more, Selene, because this actually fits with what I was thinking about. You were saying, what vocabulary do we like to use? And I like to go back to Aristotle, actually, not just because I'm a nerd, but I since first reading him, I liked the idea of the potential and the accidental. And I'm also terrible at introducing myself. So I failed to mention that I'm the chair of the Serendipity Society, which you are all happily members of now too. And Wendy has been a huge help in that. But this idea of serendipity is a similarly positive spin on what we often think of as a negative jarring or taking away from a process, right? So what positive things can come out of getting distracted, for example. But and Aristotle too tends to focus on potentiality as this thing that gets interrupted by accident. So you have the potential, an acorn has the potential to be an oak tree, right? So that potentiality is within its nature from the very beginning, and it's part of everything about what that acorn is. But if a squirrel eats the acorn, well, that's an accident interfering with that potentiality, right? But he always talks from the perspective of the acorn, right? But he doesn't talk about how the squirrel needs the food. And so its potential requires this kind of interference in someone else's potentiality. And so this, you do get this sense in Aristotle, but the negativity, if you look at accidents, is a more a positive disjunct, right? So a difference that is a difference maker, it can actually change something about it. It creates new potentialities in many cases. It's not just that the potentialities are all existent within there, they also exist within situations. And when it becomes food, well, now it's nutrition. Now it has a different set of potentialities, right? So if you kind of look at it that way, I mean, there's a bit of a loss, but there's also a gain. And so this is how I kind of think of the possible as that possible gain out of accident.
I love this. You know that I try not to romanticize the possible as much as I can, because of course I'm committed to the concept. But for me, always when I do that, I think of infinite possibility as an absolute nightmare. Like when you walk into a shopping mall and everything, like you have 100 versions of cereals. I mean, you will be blocked. At least I'm blocked. I am. Yeah. Pick one, whatever it is. So infinite possibilities is definitely not good. But you now bring a very interesting idea of the disruption of the possible, because when you come from psychology, the psychology of creativity, it's very much kind of geared towards that language of agency, even mental health, psychological health. The more possibility, the more empowerment, and so on. And I really like this idea that the possible kind of erupts and disturbs what is supposed to be maybe a more linear relationship, because there is something about the non-linearity of the possible that it comes in.
If I may jump in just here, because the things that attracts me the most about the possible as you define it is that I've also, preparing for this chat, I've listened to the other videos and read a bit much about the possible as you defined it, and you used the words, or also Wendy used the words ontological instability, and the fact that the possible and the actual are, of course, in a way opposed, but also interacting with each other and affecting one another. And I think that a way to see the possible could be as we see freedom, which is freedom to or freedom from. And these are two very different ways to see freedom and to see how can you do if you're free from something or if you're free to do something. And in the same way as the possible could be a possible to the possibility to do something, or the possibility just to imagine something and avoid that possibility. And in the same way, I think I've already said that I'm interested in ignorance, and I think that ignorance can be approached in two ways, in these kind of ways too, because ignorance can be a stable concept and a very ideal concept as a lack of information, a lack of knowledge and so on, or a dynamic concept that interacts with the limitation of the agents as well as possibilities. And in that sense, the possible seems to me an interesting concept, because it doesn't speak to you about something you know, something you could know or can know. And I read yesterday about your paper on allocentrism, and I wanted to speak to you about the concept of other, because for me, other is something which I don't know. Ultimately, I cannot know.
Right.
And feeling other, being other for others, it's kind of, it blows my mind, the thinking about it.
Well, I hope I didn't do too much damage with that paper. I mean, I just picking up to give a bit of context, I was talking about allocentrism, which is not really a notion I invented. I think it's been talked about, at least in psychology, from what I remember. But it was kind of recognizing the otherness of the other as this source of immense possibility, and without immediately wanting to domesticate it, and also recognizing that you are an other to other people. So there's a double relationship there that I think it's very interesting, because again, from psychology, and I'm sorry I'm speaking from this disciplinary perspective, but it's always nice to meet exactly this difference, a la Derrida. We look so much at subjectivity, and we put the person at the center. So it's always your experience, and the other is always this other person. But it's almost reversing a bit the tables on this discussion of subjectivity, intersubjectivity. How do you look like an other to other people, and how can you embrace that possibility that comes with this status? So I think that's what I meant there. Yeah.
I think this is why I focus on expectations so much, because, and just to get personal for a little bit, being from a small town where everybody knows you and your parents and recognizes the truck you drive and tells your father where you are on Saturday night, et cetera, the buildup of expectations about who you are and who you are expected to be can get a little overwhelming. Which I think is why many young people bust out to the big city for as soon as they can. But I remember going to conferences or places where I didn't know people, and there you became possible again, right? Suddenly the expectations weren't the first thing that you had to meet. And again, maybe I find this is also a very female thing to do, with this idea of assimilating expectations about yourself beforehand in order to project those in response. It's just the way I tend to respond to social situations, in full confession. But having been build up all these expectations, right, and then discovering possibility somewhere else, it changed my self-perception of someone who was, a linear or a progressive or a simple kind of machine that goes through life and just builds upon and builds upon and builds upon, and opens up this idea that you can take like a sharp left or a sharp right, even within yourself. And I remember that as being one of the first experiences of possibility, right? It's as a self possibility. So I think agency is so important in these discussions as well.
I think what's really interesting that's coming out just listening is that there can be a tendency to think about the possible as being an individual thing or something that you own. So you project possible futures. When we talk about it, we talk about you thinking about what could be, and there's, because we think about it as being an internal thing, a sort of projected sense out there in the world that's projected from you. But what's really interesting is coming out of all of you is you're talking about possibility actually arising from action and interaction with other people, so that other people both shape, constrain, and build your possibles. And there's a little bit there about possibility as a constraint, you know, that your possible selves are sort of constrained by social ideas, but also then built within that. So what is possible is not just determined by yourself. And I think that's that building of possible interaction and moving forward is really important to, I think it, I'm writing my presentation at the moment for the conference. So I'm thinking through a lot about what the possible could be seen to be, which is individualistic, which is purely mental, which is purely all of those things. But actually, as soon as you start discussing with anybody, we talk about those interactions. We talk about the material realities that shape your possible. We talk about those things that help the possible as it is enacted in action with other people. And yeah, I just thought I'd pick up on that because you've all said something very similar.
And about we discussed about creating the self or creating the possibility of self with other people, but I think that sparked an interest when Samantha spoke about expectations. And I think Vlad talked about also in the paper on allocentrism, he talked about dialogical construction of the self. And it reminded me a phrase, a sentence from Margaret Atwood in The Handmaid's Tale when she wrote, "I need to compose myself as I compose a speech." And of course, she was talking about something dramatic and negative in a way, but actually we try to compose ourselves in the matter of expectation, in a matter of dialogue with other people, and how to in the matter of how we present ourselves to other people. So I think it's connected in a way how we compose ourselves in that sense.
Right. I mean, I'm very stimulated by this conversation because as a social psychologist, self-other, this is what our bread, butter, self-other, anyway, analogies. But I feel it's very interesting also that within ourselves and within the encounter with the other, there are forces that work against possibility in the way we understand it here. So there are self-expectations, there are ways in which we construct ourselves, and we love as human beings regularity. I mean, there is so much work in cognitive psychology and cognitive science around how we are so quick to familiarize the unfamiliar. This is really the way cognition works: find patterns and analyze and so on, stabilize the unstable, organize the mess. And that's kind of against this view of the possible that is very open and open-ended. And also with other people, you have the exact dynamic of what does the other expect of me. So it's very constraining. And this is where me personally, I love to draw the line between a kind of an ontological argument, and I'm afraid to use this word with you philosophers here, but let's go with it, and distinguishing it from the realities of everyday interactions. Because a lot of people, and this is an argument that goes back to creativity work done on group creativity. A lot of studies demonstrate, especially in artificial experimental conditions, that actually working with other people might harm your creativity when defined in a specific way, of course. And that for me is perfectly fine. A lot of people would assume that because I'm a socio-culturalist, I always think that the more the merrier. Of course not. Of course not. So I think when you look at concrete cases, it's great to realize these possibility constraining influences of other people. But I think at the end of the day, without a self-other difference and gap that is continuously being opened and reopened through accident, serendipity, materiality coming in, there would be no sense of possibility. If we were really fully able to know the other completely, to domesticate the other, and there wouldn't be any need for dialogue, for communication. We'd just think the same way. So possibility and emergence and novelty would be gone. So I feel that it's very interesting that it's good to acknowledge all of these forces that work within self-other relations to constrain possibility and within ourselves, but also to leave room for a more foundational argument that without a self-other encounter, you can't have possibility. So I think possibility at the encounter, can we call it that, or at the border? I don't know. I'm throwing in new concepts here.
Can I give you not a counter argument, but an additional negative argument that might prove your positive case? Because you mentioned that too many possibilities or infinite possibilities is not a good thing. And part of the reason why it's not a good thing is because it leads to inaction. You have no path to take. And so when you said that, I was reminded of when my daughter was 3, and every room became a room of infinite dangerous possibilities, right? But I also didn't know enough about where she was going to go or what she was going to do in that space that I could predict and therefore act strategically in any way, right? So I was left with the infinite possibilities. I actually use a very similar argument when I'm describing being towards death in Heideggerian philosophy, where it's an embrace of the fact that one of those infinite possibilities is death, and you don't know which one it is. It could happen at any time. So you are constantly faced with the infinity of death as a possibility, right? And it's a similar kind of it reduces your agency because you can't pick which direction to go in. And so I think this can be a dangerous aspect of possibility as well. And we see this, the not all men argument is a similar problem, where that every man is a possible something, and because of the constant barrage of imaginative possibilities that are negative, those fill up the space of possibility when you meet a new person at a bar, right? And then because of that cultural filling up of that space of possibilities with negative possibilities, those are the likely actions, right? Your possible probabilities become unidirectional. So you can be faced with too many possibilities and you can't act, or you can be faced with overwhelming certain kinds of possibilities that then push you into certain kinds of actions because you have to assume that they are more possible because there's more of those possibilities. So I think there's a positive argument here in the sense that we need to fill up our space with positive possibilities, right? And this is where art comes in and where creativity can be so good, and where sometimes teamwork can actually make you more creative when you're working with the kind of people who are actually generating more possibilities in that context. That's why serendipity, I think, is people love it so much because it does that for you, right? It's like oh boy, a possibility.
No, it's very interesting indeed. What possibilities do we actually construct? I mean, it's sorry, I'm talking way too much, and I really want to listen more. But I'm so stimulated by these ideas because, I'm clarifying my own thinking, and what I love about possibilities, this open-endedness of it. But at the same time, it is very much constructed and solidified in some ways all around you. So the possible that is not real is still made real by all these anticipations, forecasts, assumptions, and so on. I'm reminded here, I also worked on social representations with Serge Moscovici in that tradition. And he said something wonderful. I mean, he said many wonderful things, but one of them was the symbolic environment sometimes has more reality and weight to it than the real environment. When in your mind you have a certain view of the norms and values, and that's it, it's as real as this table over here I'm looking at, if not even more constraining, because the table I can maybe push away, but my value that I've internalized, I can never kind of move away from it. So I feel like what we fill up the space of the possible with is so crucially important. And yet there is yet another dimension, which is for me the complete moment of open-endedness when you just know or intuit or feel that there is more to it. And I don't know how maybe phenomenologically we can talk about that. And my wife, who does a lot of crafts, just to bring in this example, we're talking about affordances, yet another concept. But she said that she keeps a lot of stuff, and then she does keep a lot of stuff to do wonderful things later on with them, because she intuits they will be useful. And when she opens her, the drawers, she doesn't know what will be. She doesn't have the thing. She doesn't have that vision, but she just knows that it will be. I mean, that feeling alone, you see, it's kind of the possible beyond the constructed possible that I also find fascinating.
I'm so all about that. I've had drawers of random things collected for years. Moving to Europe, I had to clean it all out. But yeah, I totally do that. Yeah. Yeah. What is that feeling? This is, a key problem in my research.
If I can jump in, I think it's okay. The problem of too much possibility. I think I think, at least, I'm not sure of it, but I think it's just an abstract concept. It's not something that affects our perspective. I mean, we never have too many possibilities. And it reminds me of an anecdote. I don't know if it's true or not, but in my first philosophy of science class, the professor told us a story about Popper, who presented his students a paper, white piece of paper, and said to them, "Okay, now observe." And they couldn't write anything on the paper because they didn't know what to observe. So that was an anecdote about how too many things to observe, or too many possibilities in this case, can be overwhelming. But actually, if someone puts you in front of you a piece of paper saying observe, you need to start from something. You need to write something on that piece of paper, and what you write defines other possibilities, the next thing, for example. So in a way, I think a very interesting aspect of the possible, if we connect the possible to an agent or agency, is that it depends on perspective, on the agent's perspective, on what he has in front of him, or in front of her, and there the accident comes into importance, when something unexpected comes and shifts your perspective. So it makes you see other possibilities you could not have imagined before. And I think it's very interesting, the things you said about too many possibilities. At the same time, it's a wonderful concept and a very difficult one to approach in an agent's perspective.
I think almost like when we talk about what's the opposite of the possible, which I know Vlad's really keen to emphasize, isn't the impossible. It's something different. I almost feel like what's the opposite of the possible is so many possibles that you can't, you're paralyzed and you can no longer act. So by not enacting the possibles, they don't materialize in anything. And I don't think an action has to be material, or it has to be an act you see it thought through. Thinking itself is an act, and sub-vocalizing whatever it might be. But until you can do that, until you can move and act on it, then it's just, and a multitude of possibles. I keep thinking about the work that I'm doing with the bowl turner. So I'm doing work with a bowl turner where I'm watching how he turns a lump of wood into a bowl like this one. So this was a lump of wood, and now it's a beautiful bowl. And the way that this bowl is only possible by constraining the possibles of the lump of wood, if that makes sense. When it comes, you can do anything with it. You can make any shape. I've seen him turn it into 3-4 different little cups, and each point. But until those decisions are made, until something turns this potential into an actual, then there's no possibility for anything. I don't know if that makes sense.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I mean, it's just very quickly jumping in with, I also draw a lot on Bakhtin and these dialogical ideas of openness and open-endedness, but there is something to be said about monologism as well. And I know that I associate it with the opposite of possibility, but it's kind of intertwined with the fabric of the possible. The moment of action is always monological. You've decided, you've made it, and then immediately it opens up again. It almost reminds me of James's metaphor of consciousness with the flock of birds, that are perching and flying and perching and flying, and these kind of movements that yeah, converge, diverge. I feel there is a lot to be said there. I feel we talk a lot about action perception loops, but we should be talking more about these closing, opening, perhaps.
The bird murmurs is a great example, because now that they're doing some research on that, right? I mean, it's so much peripheral vision and so much awareness and situational awareness, right? So the birds are detecting where the other birds are. And I don't know enough about the science to say exactly how they're doing that. But this idea that I think people are trying to capture that with flow, but flow tends to be a very individualistic concept, the way that people talk about it. But I think flow happens in groups and in life and with each other, right? Sometimes we're in flow with the people around us, even moving through a train station or something, and sometimes there's a kick. There's something that makes us go into flow with each other, that tunes us all in, this idea of it's some kind of a salience, right? That we can build in, that's in there. And it works similarly, I think, to the way the bird murmuring works, in the sense, to have that word right, is it murmuring? Like, and but it's peripheral vision. It's this constant awareness of yourself within a context, right? Because it's not a selfless awareness. It's not only an other directed awareness by any means, because you have to place yourself in that flow to move within it properly. You have to know enough about your own body and what you are in order to do the right things in that flow. And so it's an interesting self and other exchange.
I wonder if in flow, whether you lose the awareness. So maybe that's yeah. So actually, to be in flow, you have to, even though you need to have all these things, they move beyond your sort of conscious awareness, and that's the point where this backwards and forwards that Vlad was talking about, and the sort of and the interruptions and the disruptions. So the interruptions are the possible. So because if you're in flow, there is no other possible. Flow is it's a dynamic state. It's a constrained state in terms of you're just going to keep, and you're not aware. The second that you move out of flow and then put yourself back in that sort of self-other dialogical relationship, then that's the space for possible, and then that's the space where and for me, accidents are things that then disrupt that and can change them.
I don't know, but what about dancing? I mean, in a crowd, right? Not just with one other person where you have performed movements, but in a crowd where you don't know how other people are moving. I mean, I don't think it's the same as flow. It's something else.
As soon as you think about how other people are moving, and you put themselves as how somebody else is moving, as soon as you construct an other self, so how other people are moving, it's only really fun if you're dancing, if you're not thinking about yourself, you're not thinking about the other people. The second, we've all had that horrible feeling where we're dancing, we all think it's great, and then somehow we slip out of it and we suddenly see ourselves and we go, oh my goodness, like you catch sight of yourself in the mirror, or you see somebody looking at you, realize that maybe you probably shouldn't have been dancing like that, or whatever it might be. But so it's only that sort of flow happens when you don't have that consciousness, I think, when you aren't aware of yourself or the other people around you. Selene is desperate to talk. Let's go.
Sorry, because for me, there is a difference between awareness as a state or awareness as a process. So becoming aware is very different from being aware of something. Being aware of something, you can be aware of dancing and not feeling self-aware. For another term of awareness here. And at the same time, if you become aware of how bad you're dancing, for example, of badly how you move around the people that are better at you and at dancing, then in that moment, maybe you can lose the flow. But when I think that in the state of being aware, maybe you cannot find possibility. In becoming aware, you can find other. And becoming aware is not always a negative feeling. It is not always the fact that, I'm realizing I'm really a bad dancer and everyone else is a good one. It can be the other way around, or it can be, wow, there is I never dance, so I don't know a good example here, but you can become aware of something you didn't expect, or even of something that you expected, but you didn't expect at that time. And that could be an interesting way to see possibilities.
Right.
I positivity, yeah.
Sorry, I love this part of the conversation because I think it takes us back to difference. Where does awareness begin? And again, I'm going to be very pragmatist about it and say that you become conscious or aware of things when there is a disruption, a micro rupture. That's when you start thinking. I mean, a lot of the pragmatist philosophy and psychology is about thought as emerging at the moment of rupture. It can be very, very micro. And I feel that indeed pure flow is undifferentiated. That is the nature of it. And therefore, yes, it might be possibility constraining, but maybe we need to save a little bit the notion of flow. I mean, I studied a little bit flow. I'm not a big flow scholar. I know Csikszentmihalyi made a lot, and other colleagues as well. But maybe there is an intrinsic differentiation and dialogicality around flow. And I'm gonna just give an example from creativity, because I worked on Easter egg decorators in northern Romania. So I did my romantic project there. And what I wanted to show was that there is creativity in tradition, in habit, in repetition, in the way people use their bodies, in almost what looks like a mechanical way, because it's always a bit repetitive. That's the nature of craft. And from that, I came out with this idea of 3 types of creativity: habitual, improvisational, and innovative. And innovative is the most visible one. It's when we face a rupture, a disruption, and then we want to do something creative. So that's usually what we celebrate as creative domains, arts and sciences and so on, and design, because people approach it with the mindset, I'm going to face this rupture, I'm going to do something new. I'm not going to just fall back on an option. Improvisation is a much more mundane. We have ruptures that we fix on the spot with different, but we still have kind of a moment in which we step out of the flow. That's what differentiates for me habitual and improvisational creativity, that you still stop your action, you get into a reflective mode, and then you want to do something, not necessarily something creative. Habitual creativity, which is what I observed with my crafts women mostly, and I think that connects to flow, is this idea that they repair ruptures as they move along. But I still wonder, and I didn't do an in-depth phenomenological analysis of this, if it's really that undifferentiated, because there are always obstacles that expertise helps you bridge. But because you have expertise, you open your eyes and mind towards new dimensions that then you tackle. Like, for instance, how beautiful and aesthetic the egg should be. Do you see what I mean? So I wonder if indeed flow is completely undifferentiated and a bit away from the birth of thinking and possibility and consciousness. Yeah.
If I might, I think I worry about flow because I worry about things that suggest you that you need to get out of yourself in order to get into the right mode of thinking. Because I think what that does is it's almost Kantian, and it's idealization that we can all get to the same space. I actually much prefer keep awareness of oneself in a context. So there can be, I like that you point out, there can be this positive awareness as well as negative awareness, right? A sense of belonging, for example, a sense that you are the cog in the wheel, that you are moving in the right ways, that you guys are all doing this together. Is that this is even on some kind of a sports team or whatever, when this kicks, right? It's not a flow. You're not unaware of your position on the field, for example. You're perfectly aware that you're in the perfect position, and this is just working out great. And I think that's different than flow. I think that's very much a self-awareness of one's own role and impact on a situation. So I don't know. I wonder if there's two kinds of things that could be two different ways of thinking about it, or two different experiences. I don't know, where sometimes this disruption and flow is just a different sense of one's own awareness. And when you have confidence, then you move with that awareness and you do the thing that you're supposed to do. You just do it, right? Because you already know what to do. But when you don't have the confidence, you aren't very self-aware of your own capacity and position, then you have to think about it, and you have to strategize, and you have to reassess, because something is mismatched. And that's when the disruption comes, right? Now you have to get yourself back in. You have to figure out who you are again in that situation, and what you have to offer, maybe. But I think there's a lot of different things happening, and flow is great when it does happen, but I don't think it's always the thing that you want to happen.
I think that also then that requires trust in all the people around you. So it's not just your own position in the team, it's all the different people. I used to play rugby, so I think quite a lot about this because I used to be in the scrum. So for those of you that don't know how the scrum's formed, I need to get everything out the way so I can show you with my hands. But you don't know the scrum, for the position that I was front row, which means that I prop up the people around me, and this is my team on this side and this is the team on the other side. Now the only way that I don't get crushed is I have to utterly rely on the people behind me to support me. So I lean right back against them. If they give way, and it's happened before, then you just fall. But more than that as well, you have to rely on the opposition. So here are the people that you're technically competing with. Okay, so technically, in theory, you're the whole aim of the scrum in rugby union is to destroy the opposition. But if the opposition don't support you at that moment when you link with them, then you will both destroy each other. Okay, and I could spend hours talking about the scrum in rugby union in terms of sort of distributed agency and distributed cognition and trust and competition, because it is the most perfect metaphor for that feeling. And each person in the scrum has their own role, and if you don't do your role correctly, the whole thing will fall down. So you have to have confidence in your role, but you also have to have confidence in your opposition. And that's honestly one of the, in terms of the feelings of most feeling part of a team or most feeling part of flow, those moments of being in the scrum are fantastic. Anyone that's ever played those positions and enjoyed them will tell you that's the pinnacle of their entire lives, because you have to have that faith and that trust whilst also competing with people. But you do also have to merge. I don't think you can't keep yourself as a stable entity. The perspectives do sort of disappear, because otherwise that it's not dialogical anymore. You move as one. And I think, yeah, so when it comes to team sports, I often think about that sort of the competition and the support, but also just the complete merging, so that you're one thing. And we do that in the language of rugby as well, as we talk about the pack or the scrum, and you become one object and one entity.
About that, that's the interesting thing, I think, about distributed cognition, and how distributed cognition relies on delegating knowledge, but also being ignorant because others know something that you don't need to know. And these other are ignorant of something you know, because you need to know, you need to move in a certain way, you need to act in a certain way. So that's the interesting thing for me about how teams move, or how or the discussion about the flows. I thought about distributed cognition also in relation to the idea of dance as a moment when you are part of the flow, or you are part of a collective entity in a way. And for me, I saw a lot of I've seen a lot of rugby matches, because my husband is a rugby player, and for me the scrum is really a strange thing that happens in a team and within teams. So for me, it was incredibly interesting hearing you talking about the fact that you rely also on the opponents, even the opponent's will to maintain the scrum as a one.
And what makes it interesting is you then lose your agents. You have the only way it will work. It's very much a leap of faith in these people who can and do frequently, unfortunately, reject. It's like, so you do have to. So in that sort of sports team thing, you do have to lose. It will only work if you allow yourself to be taken over by the unit.
But not just anybody can do that though either, right? You have to have certain skills and knowledge and awareness of what other people are expected to do, etc. So there has to, like if you put me in a rugby scrum, for example, no one could rely on me. I am infinite possibility in a rugby scrum, right? I'll screw it all up because nobody knows which way that I'll possibly go, and I don't even know. And so I wonder how much of that loss of agency is dependence on kind of, there's a lot of trust, as you mentioned, right? So is this a reduction of possibilities to create a space in which you all accept that these things are possible and only these things? Just to get back to possibilities, because what happens when you don't know anybody? And they try to create this in trust games, right? You don't know anybody. Okay, now fall into each other's arms, etc., because it's supposed to put you in this space of trusting someone. But they frame the whole situation very carefully so that it's not random people falling into random arms. It's very structured. It's everybody knows when it's going to happen. So it's not quite the same thing as really coming into a group of people you don't know anything about. And is it then do we need to have those agreements before we can have those kinds of situations?
I think maybe there's also the element of risk as well, which maybe also then constrains your possibilities to some extent, and then that's where sometimes some of the language and discussion about possibility or about merging yourself, all of these things becomes a sort of comes from a place of I hate saying place of privilege or that sort of thing, but it's very easy to talk about imagining what could be, what would be, but those things are so often constrained by our position within a society and what we can possibly do and what we can't possibly do. And for example, just to go back to the scrum, because you talk about that, you run a risk. The scrum, that you can't play front row on the scrum without experience, which is quite odd because you can't get experience without playing. It really is the proper catch-22. And that's the place where if people are going to break their backs, that's where they'll break their backs. So the loss of agency also brings with it it comes with a risk. So a risk attached to it in a very different way to other forms of sort of trust and collaboration. But even those also carry risks.
Yeah, I was going to say they're all risky.
All collaboration carries risks, like even if it's just a time sink or whatever it might be. And maybe those risks are something to take into account when we think about what's possible and what's not possible, and how people then work with those risks and how important those risks are to them.
I feel like I should have studied rugby. Why did I choose Easter eggs? No, because I also have no experience of these sports. But it's fascinating, and I think this case study, in a way, we should maybe think deeper and maybe do something with it, Wendy. Now that you are completely our expert here, it shows exactly the self-other dynamic I've been talking about. While my PhD and the way I started was very much the material aspect, because although there is a social element, of course there is, to the way craftsmen and craftswomen work, it's definitely the material, and the accidental comes in there, and the flow comes in from just having your perspective rewarded by your environment and so on. But I just love this idea, and the risks associated with the possible. It's a very interesting concept. Yeah.
I mean, as a small example, I mean, if you have a drawer full of crafts and you're randomly creating them, at some point you have to start to decide which ones you're going to keep and which ones you're going to get rid of. And it's all risky, because every time you get rid of one, in a couple of years, that's, if I just had that random piece of thing, I could do this craft.
But that's also constrained by your material circumstances, because if you have a massive house and a craft cupboard,
it's the size of your cupboard.
All crafters want a walk-in craft cupboard, right? So if they had a walk-in craft cupboard, they wouldn't be so risky keeping or losing something.
Yeah. And the risk comes also when you overdo something. In relation to craft and craftsmanship, if you put too much effort or too much material in something, you can ruin a beautiful picture. For example, you can ruin something you were working on for weeks, maybe. Exactly, Wendy. That's my.
This is the bowl where he took. I mean, I like this. I actually think it's the most beautiful bowl. I really like the wave that came, but the wave came because he decided he wanted to take off one more thin bit inside. So the bowl worked, but that one more thin bit, he didn't know when to stop, and that then it caught on something, and the whole thing. I mean, I think it's beautiful. That's why I've kept it.
Yeah, and you make new possibilities out of it. Absolutely. I mean, that's in the literature on craft. There is this notion of craftsmanship of risk and craftsmanship of certainty, and there is a lot of work done on mechanical reproduction versus what craft brings, which is exactly the risk. And I feel like uncertainty, not knowing, I mean, all of these topics that kind of bring us together are such kind of landmarks within this process where we're all kind of getting at somehow. Yeah, wonderful to have the material example as well of what can happen. That is the outcome, an outcome of possibility that opens up new possibility, because yeah, I love it too.
I have to hear about this craftsmanship of risk, risk, because that's such an interesting idea. I wanted to throw something out there since I have you all. What about leaving space? And craftsmanship of risk might be something that does that, leaving space for the possible. So in the sense that, this might just be justification for my procrastination, but I like to think that I actually tried to do that in a sense where I stopped shy of trying to perfect things almost on purpose. And it's not just because otherwise I'd never finish, but it's also because I've found that if there's just that little room for something, if you leave an idea as a note instead of putting it into the text and then pass it on to someone else, these little unfinished things create this space for possibility. Is that something that you see in craftsmanship of risk? I'm curious.
Right. Absolutely. I feel like, well, the example of my wife's drawer with so many things, it's one technique. It'd be wonderful, by the way, it just came to my mind. Another research we could do, or someone listening should do, is on the practices of possibility. What do you do to allow that space of openness to still exist there? So I feel like with the craftsmanship, I just have one wonderful line from an interview with a woman who was decorating, who said, "It is more difficult for me to make the same egg twice as to make different things." So there is, for them, the excitement was that the whole thing of the egg being so different, we don't see that, but eggs are actually quite different in terms of shape, exactly how they are and how big they are. So when you have a motif, you can never apply it identically in the same way to the egg. So I feel that their own practice of possibility was just challenging themselves with new types of eggs that you can really decorate plenty of, like from ostrich to pigeon. I've seen some pigeon eggs wonderfully decorated. You need very good eyes for that. But yeah, there is an element of keeping the door open for more to happen. And I think there is an element of daring as well. Like I've seen craftswomen making some Christmas eggs, which were kind of risky in the cultural context. Although, funnily enough, in other places in Europe, I think in the Danish tradition, have these porcelain beautiful eggs that you sometimes put in a Christmas tree. So there is nothing, that is possible that has not been slightly at least attempted somehow. But yeah, practices of possibility, that would be an amazing, like, concrete idea to look at. What other practices do you guys think about?
I was thinking about when Samantha mentioned the possibility of leaving space for chance or possible. I immediately thought about the fact this year I taught my first course in a university of cognitive philosophy, and I ruined the course myself. It's a self-criticism that I do about this course, because I put too many slides in every lesson, every lecture. I do a lot of slides, and I love doing slides because it makes me less anxious. It's always better for me to have too much material instead of too less. So, and in that sense, I didn't leave any space for possibility, and I didn't finish any lecture as I thought I would, because there were too many questions from students and too many comments and reflections on and so on. So it was, every lecture was in a way unfinished, and in that sense, since I did not leave any space for this kind of possibilities, it was an unfinished work just for that reason, not because I didn't plan. I did plan an unfinished work. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it's you wanted to tame possibility, but you unleashed possibility. It's kind of a counter effect of going against the intention. Absolutely.
When my children asked me why anyone would buy a wooden bowl, as they said when they told them how much they cost, the wooden bowl, they said, "Well, why would you bother when you can get one for 50p from Tesco's?" And I showed them how the inside of the bowl, so the inside of the bowl, you won't ever be able to see it, but one day you can maybe feel it, is ridged, and that slowly wears down over all the years that it's used. And what I actually said to them was, by buying a bowl like this, which it's not even purposely not finished, it just can't be finished perfectly, because the only way this bowl can be finished is through use. You can't mimic that in a creative sense. So that, and I said that's why people buy it, because they will have their own process. They'll be embedded into it. So by making it unfinished, you increase the range of possible contributors to the creation of that bowl, right? And then the different forms of memories and things it can absorb. So in this case, leaving it unfinished is not only necessary part of the process, but it's what makes it special, I think.
I need to add just one small thing to this, because the pipes work in the same way. When you got the pipe doesn't smell of anything, doesn't smell of tobacco, doesn't smell of wood, because depending on which kind of tobacco you like to smoke, you like to smell the odor, then the pipe is actually finished in that sense. It's actually a functioning pipe, and you need to spend time putting that kind of smell into pipe in order to have a finished one, a pipe you can actually use.
In Nova Scotia, it's people's cast iron pans that they're obsessed with for similar reasons. They've spent years making bacon in that cast iron pan, and don't you put any soap in that, because the curing is considered not necessarily a technological process, but a personal process that you actually, you've got your meat pan and your not meat pan, and you've got, you don't mess with those. And it's because of this cultivation and this personal relationship with the object too, which is really interesting.
I love the idea of finishing it through use. It's wonderful indeed. It goes back to self and other. It goes back to, I don't know, most like Umberto Eco's ideas of the open work. Most of the things we do are in a way an open work, because they're always open, at least to interpretation. But how much how much deliberation there is in that. And I work with this colleague, Ron Baguero, Wendy knows him quite well. And he talks about lesson unplanning. And this is a wonderful and structured uncertainty. So he's comes from education and psychology, but mostly, kind of very, very educational. And he talks about how we need to give room in a classroom for asking like unknown questions. You challenge yourself when you raise a question that you don't know the answer to, and how rare is that in our classrooms? And I think it's very rare, and you need to fight your own kind of urges there. And his whole idea is that you need some structure. So that's why structured uncertainty, that you can't really demolish everything, because again, you go into that anxiety kind of state of what's going to happen next. But you need to create this oasis of possibility within a structured practice. So I think that's another way of thinking about, technologies of the possible. Technology sounds ugly, but maybe not. I don't know. Samantha, you work in a technology kind of focusing. How do you feel about technologies of the possible?
Oh, you can use it for anything. It's so
technologies of the possible.
But what you're talking about sounds a lot like teaching philosophy, because you get confronted by questions you can't answer, and unless you're comfortable with that, and teaching philosophy at an engineering school is disruptive sometimes for students in the sense that I ask a lot of questions that I don't answer. I ask them questions in class, and then I don't give them the answers, and then I tell them there are many answers, and it's difficult if they give me an answer, ask them more questions. And so I'm just like a badger when it comes to opening up new possibilities for teaching philosophy, because that's really, I think, the great thing about philosophy for me anyway, is because that's what it's about. It's about prodding, poking apart things and finding those differences and inquiring into them. And devil may care. It doesn't matter if I get an answer. It doesn't actually matter. As long as I ask a really good question and then ask some more really good questions, I'm doing great philosophy. Right. And so it's kind of nice that way.
Privileged discipline, exactly, to work with these ideas. Absolutely.
We are sort of coming towards the end, I think, of the time that we've got for this. So it might be nice to sort of start to draw it to a close, and then we've got a few minutes to talk. So I didn't know if you wanted to think through what it is that you've most got out of this conversation still, what it is that's most struck you as being an important part when we're moving forward and thinking about this, the possible as a stable research field. I certainly, the idea of the possible arising in perspective, in difference, in dialogue, the idea of projecting that possible then out onto other people, I think is really interesting, and the importance of other people, materials, and structuring and creating and generating possibles. So not just constraining them, although we did talk about the possibility of risk, but also in generating the possibles.
If I can say what I bring out from this conversation, I'm so grateful because first of all, let's start from the ending. The idea of structure uncertainty is very appealing, but the idea of structure ignorance or unstructured ignorance could be even more interesting in that way. And it seemed weird for me, but I prepared a bit for this chat, and I found very interesting things in the preparation of this chat. And the chat went to a complete different direction of what I expected. So I read a bit, I reread the paper on microserendipity. I was ready to talk about that. I reread some works about from Samantha. I said, okay, then we will talk about serendipity in that way or another. And then this conversation went in other ways. And I appreciate every moment, especially the idea of flows for me is incredibly interesting, and the difference between being aware, awareness, or the open and closing of consciousness or being aware, that for me is terribly interesting and useful.
I mean, I'm so grateful for all these ideas. I think we visited so many interesting concepts that luckily we have a recording because I didn't take notes, but but I can go and revisit. One thing I understood is that I should have studied rugby, but more concretely, I think one of the things that I'm going to think about is this idea of technologies or practices of possibility, and the way people actively aim to cultivate possibility and what happens with that aim of theirs. And I love your example, Selena, with trying to go against possibility just to discover more possibilities. So I feel like there is such an open universe of that. I feel like this concern, this human concern for openness and for variety and diversity and difference is so fundamental for us, and the way it enriches our lives. I mean, I know that we talk in today's society about the rejection of difference, and we talk about others and otherness and alterity, and there is such a big thing there. But I think fundamentally, we are novelty-seeking beings in some ways. We love comfort, but it is the difference that gives that spark to life. And I feel like we do have practices and we do have concern for that. And that's where possibility also finds its place there.
Great conversation and very fun. And I have like a pile of scattered notes that I'll have to sort into sentences later. But definitely this idea of, I hadn't thought of Derrida's difference in this context. So that's a fun idea that I'll talk about. And I like this practices of possibility idea as well. But as Wendy mentioned, we also talked about the risks, and I think kind of today kind of reinforces my idea that I think what we need to do is make it less risky to be possible, right? And so possibility practices of possibility are a good thing to start with, right? So how do we create the space for the possible in a positive way, and without making it infinite possibilities, and without making it risky, and without clouding it up with a bunch of not great possibilities? How do we populate it with great possibilities without closing off those options? And all of this is just it's such an interesting discussion, and I think it's so important for us as humans, right, to talk about these things, because we tend to comfort ourselves by thinking that what we really need is the perfect plan and backup plan and robustness, etc. But working with resilience, more and more even engineers are dealing with the fact that what we really need are transformative possibilities. Even in our very basic infrastructures, we need to think about the potential for transformation in the face of crises and the unexpected. And so when we're bringing that down to the level of like engineering, when we're talking, then I think there's definitely something about our need to transform as humans that we've gotten locked in this particular historical era in some assumptions about what we've always been like, and I think people are really ready for the possible. So it's a timely and important field, and I think the more concrete we can talk about it, and the more we can talk about these real examples about how they fall into place in life and what positive outcomes they have, I'm these conversations need to happen.
Fantastic. Well, thank you ever so much for your time and for coming to think about these things. It's been wonderful. I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for the ideas. And I think Vlad came up with about 20 different new research projects that we'll be looking for people that are watching this to write to us and say, yeah, we'll collaborate with you on that. So and this should go up on the YouTube site before the conference, which is happening in a couple of weeks. So hopefully we'll be able to get this up just before then. And if people are watching this and then they're interested in the conference, or you probably won't, you might be watching it 500 years after the conference, that could be possible, I reckon. Then the conference videos will be on the YouTube channel anyway, so you won't have missed anything.